Welcome back to Tanya in 5. Today, we're going to discuss the second half of chapter 7. In the first half of chapter 7, the Alter Rebbe told us of two levels of divine unity. The higher unity is that God is the only truth, and all that exists is nullified within Him. The lower level of unity is that God invests Himself within every detail of existence, and therefore there is nothing apart from Him because He is within all. And from there we established that God's knowledge of us is not at a distance where He is observing some foreign phenomenon called our existence, but rather by knowing Himself, He knows our existence because He is within our existence. Now from here, the Alter Rebbe goes to a central discussion that became a bit of a point of contention between him, the Hasidim, and those who opposed the Hasidim, in terms of how they understood a statement of the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the famous Kabbalist. You see, the Arizal said that considering that God is infinite, in order for God to create finite worlds, God had to, quote, remove Himself, known in Hebrew as the Tzimtzum. God had to remove His infiniteness and create a conceptual space in which finite could exist. And within that empty space, God invested a finite amount of energy with which He created our world. Now, there were those that understood this to mean that when God removed Himself, it means quite literally, He removed Himself. He no longer exists within that empty space. Now, of course, they also agree that God is everywhere. But what they mean is that God is not invested within limitation. He's not invested within the physical, even though He exists everywhere. To use an illustration, the concept of love, or the concept of 1 + 1 = 2. These are both concepts, one emotional, one intellectual, and they exist everywhere. But they are not invested within everything. 1 + 1 = 2 doesn't exist inside the table. Love doesn't exist inside the table, even though, because it's a concept and it's not limited by space, it's everywhere. But it doesn't exist within every space. It only exists in a heart and a mind that serve as vessels that can actually handle these concepts, love, or the theory of 1 + 1 = 2. So they said the same thing about God. God is indeed everywhere, but He doesn't invest Himself within this lowly, even despicable reality called the physical world. God should be invested within that? No way. He is everywhere, but not invested within the physical, within the lowly. Now, the Alter Rebbe says, in his position, that there are two problems with this. Number one, to say that God does not exist within something is to say that there is a space, even a conceptual space, in which God is not present. He is there, but He's not within. And if He's not within, then that theoretical space or level of within our reality is void of God. And that would be a limitation on God. Problem one. Problem two is that if God is not invested within something, then His knowledge of that thing is an addition to Him. It's like at a distance. He exists outside of it, and He knows about it. And that would mean His knowledge is an addition to Him, and if it's an addition to Him, it would undermine the pure unity of God, and that He is one and only one and nothing else. And therefore, the Alter Rebbe's position is that when the Arizal said that God removed Himself to allow for limitation, it's not literal. God is still invested within limitation. God Himself is invested in all the minute limitations of every sphere, space of reality. Literal space, spiritual space, conceptual, emotional, intellectual, every space is completely full of God's truth. God's invested in all of it. And when the Arizal said that God removed Himself, it means He removed His revelation. That we do not experience this fact that God is within us. But in reality, He is. Now, God being within all of our reality can be compared, by way of example, to the way I would imagine a palace. Say I am thinking about and imagining and picturing in my mind this large palace. Now, every part of the palace is completely filled with me, because I'm thinking about it. Whether we're talking about the bathroom in the palace or the king's throne room, I and my thought exist and permeate all of it equally. And not just at a distance, but every single nook and cranny of this palace is filled with me, because it only exists within me. And secondly, when I want to design the bathroom in my palace, I have to get and contract my thoughts to be thinking about the specifics of that palace, or that part of the palace. So likewise, it is God's relationship with our world. First of all, God permeates every element of our reality, or of all realities, equally. He is equally present in all of his essence, in every single part of reality. Completely and fully invested in every single part. Number one. Number two, in order for each individual creation to have its particular limits in accordance with its existence, God has to enclose himself, and God has to limit himself, as it were, to design that specific creation. The takeaway from all of this is, when we say that God knows everything we do, we should not envision it as God is somewhere far off in his palace with his arms folded, looking down at us and watching us. No. God is invested and knows every single detail of our lives because he is within them. What comfort, what consolation that brings, knowing that God is within every detail of my life, from the best to the most painful. Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude chapter 8.